Hello and welcome to Coffee with Cafe. I'm Chef Kurt Bachman and I serve as the president of Auguste Escoffier School of Culinary Arts. Escoffier is proud and honored to partner with Cafe in hosting these Trends presentations, which help fulfill Cafe's mission of linking the food service classroom with the food service industry. Auguste Escoffier School of Culinary Arts is a learning community, and our goal is to help prepare students for exciting and satisfying careers in the culinary and hospitality industries. We do this by providing professional programs which are focused on sustainability, farm-to-table philosophy, and business operations. Students who choose to study with Escoffier are offered an accredited education through the flexibility of 2 residential campuses or online programs. So thank you again for joining us today, and please enjoy this week's presentation.
Greetings to all of you, and I want to first of all thank you for taking the time to be with me today to talk about umami. I'm Chef Chris Koetke, and I am the Executive Corporate Chef for Ajinomoto Health and Nutrition of North America. And for many years, I was in culinary education, and so talking to other educators is always something I absolutely love to do, and especially talk about something that I think is so powerful and something that we can bring into our instruction, which is umami. So today we're doing this in 2 parts. The first part is what I call Umami 101. It's really just let's dig in, let's look at the science, and let's figure out what is this thing that is called umami that everybody's talking about. And then in the second part, it's really let's dial it back and let's talk about how do we get it into our classrooms. So let's, without further ado, get going on our presentation here. So the first thing is, let's talk a little bit about this thing called umami. Where does it come from? What's the history on it? And you're going to see on the left side of your screen, there's 3 flags there. And each flag is indicative of a very important part of the discovery of umami. So the first is Germany in the 1850s. And there a chemist discovers an amino acid called glutamate, which is really important to our discussion today. And then moving to a Japanese flag, you're going to see a picture of a gentleman next to it. That's Dr. Ikeda. And he was a chemist at the University of Tokyo. And in 1907, 1908, he discovered what this thing is that he then called umami. So he is really the father of our understanding of umami, and he also named it as such. He was also the founder, by the way, of Ajinomoto a couple years later. So fast forward down to the American flag. And so in the year 2002, well, I should say before 2002, for those of you who are as old as I am, you may remember that, there was this whole thing about, I don't know, is umami really a thing? Is it like this Asian piece of wisdom? What is it? And in 2002, that whole thing was put to bed once and for all because University of Miami discovered the taste receptors for umami and the pathway into the brain. And that basically said, yes, it is absolutely our 5th taste and one of our core basic tastes. Now, if that's true, that means that us human beings, we've been tasting umami ever since the beginning of time because we have taste receptors specifically wired for umami. And so if you look kind of at that map off to the right, you see that umami and umami-rich ingredients are all over the world. And they're loved because umami is one of those core tastes that is loved from the time that we are itty-bitty, tiny, tiny babies. And of course, if you go further back and you look at something called, garum that the ancient Romans put into everything, basically fermented fish juice, that was all about umami because that is an umami bomb. And of course, if you kind of say, ooh, that's gross, guess what? That's really what we're putting into all that beautiful food in Southeast Asia and those fish sauces today. So let's get into the science, all right? Now, this is a slide I'm sure many of you know, which is proteins are composed of amino acids. So you see all these different amino acids, there's 20 of them. And they all fit together to make this chain that we call a protein. And that's important because, interestingly, the amino acids on their own have taste. It's not something we taste very often. You'll see that there's two of them there that have umami perception. The big one there, of course, is glutamate. That's really the biggest of the two. And then other ones are specifically sweet. And the majority of amino acids, when tasted alone, actually taste bitter. Now, whoops, went too far. There we go. So why is that important? This is a slide that is so core to understanding what umami actually is. Because if you have that long strand of protein, or long strand of amino acids, that protein, and that bumps into an umami taste receptor, nothing happens. The reason is it's too big. And so what you have to do actually is you have to separate out that amino acid, that glutamate, and what we call free glutamic acid. It has to be separated from the protein at which it's small enough to engage our taste receptors for umami. So basically, when you have free glutamic acid on its own, that is what is umami. That is the taste. That's how we perceive it. So the other sort of thing there is called a ribonucleotide, and I'm just going to keep you in suspense because it's really cool, and we're going to get to that in a few slides. Now take a look at the chart there on the left, and you'll see, like, for instance, Parmesan. Parmesan has tons of glutamate in it. But that number, that 8,210, it doesn't mean anything from a taste perspective. What matters is that free glutamic acid to the right, which is 1,600. Now, when you see that number, that is why when that server comes to the table and says, do you want some Parmesan on top of your pasta? What they're really saying is, would you care for some umami on top of your pasta? Because that's really what's going on. All right, now, how do we get that amino acid out of the protein? Because as we all know, proteins denature pretty easily, whipped cream, etc. But to actually break apart a protein requires a lot more energy and a lot more sort of effort to do it. So these are the mechanisms by which you can free glutamic acid from proteins. Things like ripening, maturation, fermentation, curing, cooking, drying. And what's happening in each one of those instances is that we're breaking apart protein. Drying is a little bit different because in drying, what happens is we're actually destroying cell walls, and inside of that cell can be a lot of free glutamic acid that then becomes available. So let's take an example, tomatoes. When tomatoes are ripe, they have far more glutamic acid, far more umami than an unripe tomato. That partially explains why ripe tomatoes taste better. Or, for instance, one of my favorite examples is cheese. So if you take a cheese and you age it, and you can see right there, we're going up to, I believe it's so small, up to 8 months, and you see the amount of free glutamic acid going up. Now imagine what that cheese will do after 3 years, or 5 years, or 10 years. And in that instance, we're getting enormous amounts of free glutamic acid. And you can pick up all of that beautiful umami in those products. And the reason, of course, in cheese and in things like, curing meats, it's the enzymes that are basically snipping apart the proteins and freeing up the glutamic acid, which is then available to our taste receptors. And also, of course, long cooking works great. All right, so I'm flying through this because Mary's like, you got 20 minutes. So the thing is, that's your kind of primer on what is glutamic acid and what glutamic acid is in regard to it being umami. Now let's bring in that ribonucleotide. Remember I talked about that a few slides earlier, because this is when things get really cool. Because you see, when you combine a glutamate with a ribonucleotide, and the two that are the most, that we talk about the most often are inosinates and guanolates. When we put those ingredients together, what happens is we get an umami explosion. And the way this is sort of explained is that when that glutamate engages the taste receptor, what happens then is that that taste receptor essentially is tasting the glutamate for a longer period of time. And so what happens now is we get not a 1 + 1 = 2 equation, but we get like a 1 + 1 = 8, or 1 + 1 = 12, or 1 + 1 = 15. And this is where taste is truly built. And it's taking that glutamate and just exploding it and truly making food that much more flavorful. And this is one of the things we're going to talk about later, is just how powerful umami is in the taste perceptions, how powerful umami is in creating great food. Hopefully by the end of today, and after you start playing with it, you'll get a sense for how that works. Now, let's take that last slide, that thing about the ribonucleotides and guanolates and inosenates. What does that mean? Let's put it into practical terms for a minute. So you see on your screen right now, you've got basically glutamate. Now, glutamate exists in all living things. And in fact, all living things make glutamate in their bodies, including us, because it's such an important amino acid. But take a look. There's your inosenates. Inosenates are found pretty much in animal and fish-based products, okay? Where the guanolates are found largely in in vegetable substances, and very often in mushrooms, which is why mushrooms are so amazingly delicious. Now, why is this all important? Let's put this now into really practical terms, because remember that what you're learning today is not actually anything new. Maybe the science is new and the explanation is new for you, but the reality is you have been cooking with this in mind ever since you first set foot in a kitchen. Because again, human beings love umami, and that has been proven with little tiny babies. It's absolutely amazing. And in fact, mother's breast milk has a very large quantity of free glutamic acid in it. So lots of umami. Okay, so let's dial this back now. So take a look. You see on the top left, you have kombu. Kombu is that dried kelp, dried seaweed. And then you'll notice on the right, you'll see dried bonito. You see that? Inosenate. What are those two ingredients? Those are the two ingredients that make dashi, which is, of course, the Japanese foundational stock of their cuisine. Now, I trained in France, and when I first started learning about Japanese food, I'm like, I don't understand this. You can take two simple ingredients, you cook them a relatively short period of time, and you get this incredibly flavorful thing. It made no sense until I understood the synergistic effect of glutamate and those ribonucleotides together. Because when you put them together, all of a sudden you get that synergistic thing. And if you ever want to try this, it's fun. You can make a broth with just the kombu and a broth with just the bonito flakes. And on their own, they're okay. Together, that's where it explodes and you get that umami bomb. So let's jump into MSG, monosodium glutamate. Now, what is monosodium glutamate? Because, a lot of people say a lot of things about it. First of all, it is basically the salt of glutamic acid. That's what it is. And glutamic acid likes to join up with something like a sodium. That's just sort of chemically how it works out. And what happens is when that crystal, because it is basically a crystal, it looks a lot like salt, when that hits your palate, it hits your saliva, what happens is that the two dissociate from each other. So salt, the sodium goes one way, and now you have free glutamic acid, and that free glutamic acid then engages your taste receptors and you have umami. So basically, what's interesting about this is that the glutamic acid in like Parmesan and the glutamic acid in MSG is exactly the same thing. There is absolutely no difference between the two of them. So what MSG delivers is pure umami. That's all it is. It's a little bit like using salt, because salt gives you pure salt, and MSG gives you pure umami. So that's the science behind it. So when we talk about what is this thing called umami, what it is, very simply, is glutamic acid swimming around on its own that bumps into your taste receptors. And MSG, well, that is exactly what it is. It is pure umami. And oh, by the way, how it's made through a fermentation process. So, like a lot of fermented products today, that's how MSG is actually made. And in the US, it's made principally out of corn. In other countries, out of things like tapioca, etc. Now let's talk a little bit about, because there's been a lot of discussion about MSG. And a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I don't cook with it, I won't cook with it, etc. We're going to talk about that in detail in the next 20 minutes. But the reality is a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about this. But let's take a look at the science behind it. So if you look just at this slide, for instance, and you see how much MSG we're actually consuming as opposed to the amount of glutamate that we're consuming in other foods, it's very, very small. And in fact, if you look at the amount of MSG that we ingest, you'll notice that the US is actually much lower than other countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. So the reality is, yes, MSG is used, but the reality is we don't actually consume nearly as much as other countries do. And of course, the safety. Because a lot of people will say, oh, I don't know, I don't think it's safe, I don't think it's number one. MSG is safe. It is not an allergen. We all know as educators what are allergens, and we know to be very, very careful of them. It is not an allergen. And in fact, you can sort of look at this slide in front of you and look at all the different agencies around the world, scientific bodies, governmental bodies that have looked at this over and over and over again, and they keep coming back to the same conclusion, which is it's safe. Put as much as you want into your food. So the reality is it's safe. And interestingly enough, if you were to sort of look at yourself, okay, and you were to make piles of different amino acids, let's say you could distill yourself down into different amino acids, and you saw little piles of amino acids on the table, the biggest pile would be glutamic acid. So that's how important it is to ourselves. So of course, it makes sense that you wouldn't be like allergic to something that is essential for life. Now let's talk about this, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, but there's a lot of discussion today about sodium reduction, within different populations, et cetera. And in fact, if you look across the United States, it's well understood that we're eating too much sodium. So how do we bring this down? And this is a really interesting strategy. And the strategy is that you replace part of the salt with MSG. Now, why does that work? Well, you can see, right here that basically MSG has less sodium than does salt. So if you, for instance, do 1/3 MSG and 2/3 of salt, so basically take a teaspoon of salt, replace that by 2/3 of a teaspoon of salt, and 1/3 of a teaspoon of MSG, what have you done? You've reduced your sodium by 25%. And if you go to half and half, you reduce the sodium by 40%, which is enormous. Now, I know a bunch of us have worked on low sodium recipes before, and the strategy was always to kind of like, put in a little extra ginger, or maybe add a little bit more, I don't know, black pepper or something to kind of fool the palate. The reason that this works so well, and I personally was amazed when I did this, remember, on the surface of your tongue and around your mouth, you have different taste receptors that are specific to your 5 different tastes, which means that you have taste receptors specifically for salt, and you have taste receptors specifically for umami. So when you dial back the salt a little bit, and then you put in the umami in its place, what happens is you're actually exciting 2 different sets of taste receptors. And so you get a flavor that's much more complete and much more interesting. Now, somebody's asked me before, well, then why don't you, just use MSG? Because if you take out too much salt, what happens then is your salt receptors are basically saying, well, stop. What about me? Don't I get something for me too? So you can't take all the salt out, because then your salt taste receptors are not being stimulated. So it's about getting both, happy at the same time. Okay, so we went through the basics here. And again, there's so much more we can say about umami. But let's just take a quick review here. What is umami? Umami is glutamic acid. Glutamic acid that is free from the protein that it was part of. And it's only when it's free that it can bump into those taste receptors, specifically for umami, that send the message off to the brain. And that We as human beings, we have been tasting that from the time, as long as humans have been humans. So that's part of our basic taste. And so if we take that free glutamic acid, which is derived from things like fermentation or long cooking or drying, etc., or through the use of MSG, which is pure umami, and we combine that with those inosinates or guanylate-rich ingredients, what do we get? We get a flavor explosion where umami is amplified in the foods that we make. And the beauty is when you cook with umami, you create beautiful, balanced food that tastes complete. A lot of people have described umami as the bass note in food. What does that mean? If you listen to music, it's rare that the bass note is the thing that you're like, oh, wow, listen to that bass. And you tend to focus on the melodies and the rhythms. But if you take the bass note out, if you take that bass section out, everything else sounds a little flat. Umami is that bass note that provides the structure for all the other flavors to sort of dance on top of. And that is one of the reasons why it's so critically important. And the rest we're going to get to in a minute. But let me finish with this last slide. And so this is the kind of what's fascinating about this. As instructors, we always want to be sort of, on the cutting edge of what's happening to be able to tell our students about current events. Like, where are we today in terms of culinary arts? I mean, obviously, things like COVID have been really challenging. But when we look at something like umami, for instance, umami is now present on 1.1% of all menus in the United States. That means it's actually listed out on the menu. That's very, very important. In 2020, 60 new products. Now, this is not in restaurants. This is, grocery store stuff. 60 products, that's a lot of products, were launched specifically with the word umami in them, because the general public now is really interested in this thing called umami. And it's our job as educators to teach them what it is, which we just learned, and what we're going to do next, which is how to cook with it. So I'll see you in about 10 minutes, and I really, really hope this was helpful. Thanks. Anyways, welcome back for part 2 of Umami. Once again, I'm Chef Chris Koetke, and very happy to be Executive Corporate Chef of Ajinomoto Health and Nutrition of North America. And one of the great things about Ajinomoto, as I mentioned on the previous presentation, is it was a company that really began at the discovery, or with the discovery, of what umami is. And most specifically, that it's that glutamate, that amino acid that's when separated from the protein, is the thing that we all crave, actually. We crave umami. So let's talk about the classroom, because I've done a lot of work in umami over a bunch of years now. And, I've learned some things about how to teach it to people. And as I mentioned earlier, for 20 years, I was in that educational world. And, I will say that, and I'm going to talk about eggs in a minute, but the reason actually that I'm here today has everything to do with one of my students who many years ago challenged me. And at the time I was teaching, garde-manger, charcuterie, and I was talking one day about, going through this list of the stuff that we're not going to use in our class. And in effect, it was our no list. And one of the things I mentioned was MSG. And the student, again, Filipino student, was, I remember, right there, and she gave me this weird look on her face, like I could tell something, I had said something. You're instructors, right? You read your class. And afterwards, at the end of class, she came up to me and she said, "Chef, but what's wrong with MSG?" And I was like, "Well, it's one of those things. It's just, we don't use those things." Clearly, I was doing what every teacher should never do, which is teach from the vantage point of not really knowing. And that's what I was doing. And then she said, "But chef, my mom had it every day in the kitchen. It was one of the staple ingredients. And now I'm curious." And then she says, "Chef, have you ever tried it on eggs?" The only thing I did right that day is I said to her, "Well, let's try." And she made the eggs with the MSG. And from that moment on, I was like, wait a minute, something is going on here that I don't understand. And then I started to dig into the science of it and really try to understand it. And then I understood what I had been saying was completely false. So that's my very sort of humble teacher story for how I got into this. But let's talk about this, because how do we bring umami into our classrooms? How do we bring it into our classrooms every day? Because it's a basic taste. And we talk about salt. If I remember correctly from culinary school, you always hear chefs saying, add more salt. We focus on salt, we focus on sugar, we focus on acid, when we're making our sauces, etc. But how often do we focus on umami? So that's what we're going to talk about here. So step number 1 is to understand the science of everything we just talked about. And that's important to relate to your students. What is this thing called umami? What is this mysterious thing that shows up on menus and on products and oftentimes is misunderstood and misrepresented? I've read it in very well-known food publications when they say things like, "Oh, this ingredient is, or this recipe is full of umami." And I look at that recipe, there's no umami in there. So it's misunderstood many times. So let's go through with our students. Number 1, and by the way, if anybody wants the presentation, I'm happy to share it. So start with that. So you start, so what is this thing called umami? Where do we find it and which ingredients, and what about MSG and how does it all figure into it? Number 1. The next thing, and be honest with me, how many of you today, if I gave you a recipe and I said, is there umami in there? And what are the levels of umami? How many of you could really pick it out? Now, this is a problem for us because many of us grew up in the age when umami wasn't a thing. When I started in the kitchen, tastes were basically 4, not 5. And so none of us grew up, I shouldn't say none of us, many of us didn't grow up with somebody making this association for us. That sucker that I lick that sends a message to my brain that's happy. How do I know that that's called sweet? Somebody had to socialize that with me. And that's where we fall short with umami. How many of us can pick it out and know what it is? And then people say like, well, what does it taste like? Well, the meaning umami kind of means deliciousness. What does that mean? And some people say savoriness or meatiness. But I will say that umami tastes like umami. Now, I know that doesn't make sense, but let me ask you a question. How do you describe the taste of salt? And this is where people get stuck, right? Because if you say, how do you describe salt? What is salt? Salt is, well, salty. You don't say salt is kind of like sugar, but not really. I don't know, it's a little kind of bitter, but not really bitter. Well, umami is a basic taste, and it's not really well describable. So step one, for yourself and for your students, get to know what it is, and this is how we do it. So let's take a look at some of the ingredients on our board over here. And the first one is, and basically my hint to you is to start with comparative tastings, really simple stuff like right here. Right here, I have 2 broth samples, just chicken broth, and I have some salt in there. But then what I would do is I would take some MSG, sprinkle in the MSG, and then very simply stir that in because it'll dissolve very, very quickly. And now I can do a taste test side by side. The nice thing about that is that when you do them side by side, you can immediately figure out what is that difference, because all I did is change one variable in a very simple preparation. So start with things like that, because what'll happen is you will go, oh, that thing, that's what umami is. And you may say it's meaty, or you may say it's savory, or whatever you may say, but you have to make the connection between what your taste receptors are feeling and putting a name on it in your brain. So that's step number one. Or for instance, let's go back to what I did originally with my student. And if you've never had MSG in eggs, oh my goodness, are you in for a treat. So I have the eggs over here, and basically what I would do is I would season these like I would normally season the eggs. So I'm going to put in a little bit of salt, mix that up, put in a little bit of, black pepper or whatever else you want to put in. But my advice to you when you're doing this is keep it simple initially. Don't put 15 ingredients in here. Don't put in, some cheese, and just keep it very, very simple. And then what I would do is I would separate out half of the eggs, cook half, and then the other half, sprinkle in some MSG. Now you may say to yourself, well, I don't know, how much MSG should I put in? Have fun with it, play with it. I mean, we're not typically out there measuring the amount of salt we're putting in eggs either. And it's not like somehow what happens if I put in too much MSG? It'll just be out of balance, okay? In which case that umami will really be sticking out. In fact, in a way that's probably too much. Just like if I put in too much salt, it sticks out too much. But by playing with it, that's how we start to understand what is that thing called umami. And so to sort of over season a little bit with umami, with that MSG, not a problem. Because remember, what is MSG? MSG is pure umami. So when I put it in, all I'm doing is putting in umami. All right. The other thing that it's super good at, by the way, and a great way to sense what is umami is to do another comparative tasting. But this time, we're going to do something that's a little bit more, a little more complex. So take a look in this pot right over here. We can kind of look right down on top of it there. There we go. And right in here, this is basically a vegan preparation. A vegan preparation that has all different beans in it, lentils in it, wild rice. And once again, you season it with some salt, put in the black pepper or whatever you're going to do it like you would normally do it, and then pull half of it out and then put the MSG in the other half. Because what's really interesting about the use of umami in vegan preparations is that I find much of vegetarian and vegan food lacks umami. And by putting that umami in, you will really notice a big jump. All right, so step number one, comparative tastings. Now, when you've gotten to that point, hopefully at this point now you're starting to say, okay, as an instructor, I feel pretty good about talking about umami because I know what it is. So the next step is, can you pick it out of different ingredients? So at this point, we're going to now reach over here. We're going to take a look at some ingredients that are naturally really high in umami and have that in there. And let's talk about these. Now you see one is kind of funny, which are these corn chips over here. But sun-dried tomatoes are loaded in umami. Shiitakes, dried shiitakes, dried in particular. Remember that drying process liberates the glutamic acid, which in this case combines with the guanylate, the ribonucleotide in here, and we get, that's why shiitakes are such an umami bomb. Or asparagus. Asparagus has a finish that is very much umami. And once you pick it out in the comparative tastings, it may be the first time that you eat asparagus and you go, oh, that thing at the end of that asparagus, that is umami. Or of course, some beautifully aged Parmesan. Now in this case, this is umami bomb all over it. But remember that cheese also has lots of other flavors along with it. Okay. A lot of times the way that I actually teach taste to students is I like to use potato chips, corn chips, because all the seasoning is right on the outside and it's really easy to pick it up and kind of put it into categories. And I find that if you take some of these chips that have the MSG in it, it's a really good way of also sort of testing, can you pick out that umami note? Because it's really strong and it makes these particularly delicious. Now, two other little hints about how do you sense umami. Umami does some other things that is kind of interesting. One thing that it does, it actually causes you to salivate. So if you think you salivate because of acid, that's true in the very beginning of your eating experience. But umami makes you salivate at the end of your eating experience, where the initial salivation from acid wears off pretty quickly. Umami builds. And so it's that thing that if you find yourself really like salivating, like, that was really delicious, what you're most likely tasting at that point is a whole bunch of umami. So think about that as you try these ingredients. The other thing is, if you think about the persistence of the 5 basic tastes, it's interesting. Most of them kind of start, peak, and drop off. Umami sort of starts in the middle and then goes up, and then it plateaus, which means of the 5 basic tastes, pretty much what you get at the end of that palate, that what's lingering on your palate, that is umami. Now, if something is like burned and bitter beyond belief, that may be eclipsed by the bitter note in the back. But most of the time, what you're sensing, that's umami. So that's another little hint about when you try these ingredients. Dried tomatoes in particular, sun-dried tomatoes, as I said, that one really, and you have to, by the way, when you try these, don't just like chew them fast and swallow. Chew it for like 45 seconds and then swallow and think about the 5 basic tastes and what's happening in your mouth. Is it salty? Is it acid? It's fascinating when you do this because, again, you will find that umami is the thing that hangs out at the end of your palate. So great exercise to do with your students. And by the way, and yourselves, right? Because for us to be able to teach it, we have to pick it up and we have to know it and we have to be able to say, ooh, that's got a lot of umami in it, or that doesn't have a lot of umami in it. And so if you're not at that point, if you can't sort of pick it out, it's no fault of your own. Remember, none of us or few of us grew up, being trained by our parents or whomever about, ooh, that's really, that soy sauce got a lot of umami in it. Can't you taste it? That's not the way we were brought up. So we have to teach ourselves. And that's a process. Okay, so put those off to the side. Next, now we've basically started off with understanding the science, doing some comparative tastings so that at this point, I sort of understand what it is. Then I put some other foods there that have lots of umami in it, and I can go, there it is. I pick it out. Step 4 is now, how do we bring this into everyday? How do we bring this into our kitchens? Because what I've noticed, again, in culinary school, somebody, says, chef, how many times have you heard this? Chef, would you taste this? Chef, would you taste my beef stew? And you taste the beef stew and you maybe say, well, it needs this, it needs that. Truthfully, how many of us have looked at our students and said, it's kind of lacking in umami a little bit? Isn't that funny? It's one of our 5 basic tastes. And we know that it's a very powerful basic taste. That's that base note that lingers on our palate. It's deliciousness. And yet, how many of us actually sort of, when we put that stew through the little rubric in our brain, how many of us take a millisecond to go, and what about the umami levels? Well, now that you're getting sort of attuned to it, you can bring that into your classroom. And now you can start to teach your students about what about that umami level? Because when we bring up the umami level, what happens? We bring in deliciousness. So in the case of this beef stew, for instance, now I have a couple of options. You see, I could, for instance, reach for ingredients that have a lot of umami in them. I could put in miso. I could put in this tamari over here, all right? You want to do a shot on the side there if we could, Mr. Calvin? So miso, I could bring in tamari or soy sauce, or I could use the MSG. Okay. How do you decide? So this is sort of where we take it next. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a spoon over here. Oops. Drop one on the floor. Grab a spoon. Try it. It's good, but the umami is missing. It doesn't have that depth of flavor. Okay. If I reach for an ingredient that has lots of umami in it, wonderful. I could put in miso. If I put in miso, just remember that when you put in miso, you get all the other stuff too. So you're going to get the flavors of miso. You're going to get the salt of the miso. So if already the salt level here is sufficiently high, you might not want to do that. Could the miso taste good? Absolutely. But again, this is where as a chef and as a chef instructor, we have to kind of make that, to teach our students. What do we do? Could we put in soy sauce? Absolutely. Absolutely. But if it's too much and it starts to taste too much like soy sauce, is that good or bad? Your choice. Or you reach for MSG. What does MSG do? MSG, remember, is pure glutamic acid. It's glutamic acid and sodium, hits your palate, they separate off, and you have pure umami. What that means is I'm introducing umami without additional tastes or flavors. Pure umami. Now, this is where I hear chefs say this all the time, like, well, I'll use umami, but I'm not going to use MSG. Like somehow it's cheating, because we know that MSG is safe. But there's still this perception among chefs that for us to use MSG is somehow cheating. Well, if we use that analogy, then so is salt, right? Because when you put salt in food, salt is pure salt. I could put in salty ingredients, and then I get all the other flavor profiles. You see where I'm going with this? Now it's really interesting. When I'm cooking now, I have MSG right next to my salt, right next to my pepper, because with that, I can now bump up umami levels whenever I need to, if that's what I want to do. It's a tool in our arsenal of creating great food. Okay, so we have to think about umami and bring it into our classrooms. The last thing is sodium reduction, which I talked about a little bit earlier on our previous presentation. And remember, in sodium reduction, I can do a few interesting things. Now, it's really hard to see this, but I mean, there they are. This one right over here is 1/3, 2/3. This is a half and half. So this one has 25% less sodium than pure salt. This one has 40% less sodium than pure salt. And so one strategy here is to actually make the mixes ahead of time and then use them in the food that you're producing. So let's just sort of play with this a little bit. What are the things you could do? So for instance, I have right over, and turn my flame on. I have right over here some vegetables that I sort of sauteed a little bit earlier, and try to warm up the pan. Instead of putting straight salt on, what could I do? By just taking that mixture of, in this case, 1/3 and 2/3, I now have given it salinity and umami, and I've reduced sodium. Super powerful. And this is where you can start to have fun and you can play. And this is what I encourage your students to do, is to play with it, right? It's not like some ingredient like MSG should be on the top shelf and locked up. No, it's there as a tool. So let's play with it and let's try to change those umami levels. For instance, it's amazingly good. Like if you put MSG onto cruciferous vegetables. What it does to a cruciferous vegetable, put it on broccoli, broccolini, put it on Brussels sprouts, absolutely incredible. And it brings out a depth of flavor that is just first-class delicious. Or for instance, I could take a piece of salmon and I could very simply sprinkle that with a little of that mixture, just like I'm seasoning it with salt, same way, little on top. Now, what's really kind of curious about this is that, remember, is that MSG is glutamate, which is a protein, and actually it increases the Maillard reaction on the outside of this. So it actually helps with browning a little bit. So use it just like you use these mixes just like you would, let's say, put it on, a piece of meat or fish or whatever. And lastly, the holy grail of what everybody wants to eat, French fries, okay? So if you want to sort of reduce sodium in French fries, because there's so much there, and not only reduce sodium, but bump up the overall flavor profile, what people are doing a lot today, of course, is kind of making their own little proprietary mixes of, spices, etc. This is a spicy chipotle ancho chili blend. And I basically would sprinkle this onto the fries, mix them up. But what's interesting about this is that this is that half and half blend. So it's half salt, half MSG instead of pure salt, and then the other stuff on top of it. Now, what's fascinating about this is that the flavor profile I get out of here is huge. Why? Because I've added the base note, and on top of that base note, all the other flavors are dancing, and it creates a really delicious and much lower sodium French fry. So what I encourage you to do, study the science, go through that basic presentation. What is it? Understand it. Then do those comparative tastings so you guys that sensitize your palate to what it is. Then find umami-rich ingredients and try to pick out the umami, because then you really get it. Then incorporate umami into your teaching and start to ask those questions. Is there enough umami in there? And by the way, for the people out there, bakers, we've been replacing part of the salt with MSG in bread. And I will tell you what it does in a sourdough loaf is unbelievable, because it brings that big savory note on top of those wild sort of sour flavors. It changes everything. It's absolutely, absolutely delicious. And then, of course, you can certainly experiment with these blends, these 1/3, 2/3, or half and half blends to reduce sodium. But these are all tools, and they're all tools that I hope you incorporate into your teaching, because remember, umami is our fifth taste, and so it deserves a lot of attention. So with that, I thank you so very much for being with me today on this first event with Coffee and Cafe, which is really fun. And I look forward to lots more in the future. Once again, thank you so much. And Mary, thank you very much for having me today.